Sukhi Hotu. Welcome to Buddhist Mahavihara's Facebook page this evening. And today's Dhamma sharing is on a topic called Food for the Hungry Mind. To share her knowledge on the topic, today I would like to invite Venerable Bhikkhuni Soma Theri from New York. Sukhi Hotu.
All right. Good morning. Hello to Udyani and everyone else that is joining us this morning. Thank you to the Buddhist Mahavihara for inviting me today. So maybe we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're all gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham tamham sangham namassami. So, good morning, friends. As mentioned, the topic that was picked today is food for the hungry mind. And well, I hope we're all hungry for Dhamma. But it's very important to actually reflect when we're talking about, for example, when we're mentioning words that can be a little bit kind of charged in the way that we use them on a regular basis, that they can bring so many different things to the mind. So, such as hunger, for example. So what are we actually hungry about? And another question that can be very skillful is also to ask ourselves, how do we nourish then the mind? So how do we fulfill essentially the hunger that we're experiencing? How does that reflect in our practice? And how does the Dhamma inspire our choices and our experience? So when we talk about hunger, usually we think about the body, right? Perhaps if it's, I think in Malaysia, it's right now in the evening. So here in New Jersey, I'm at Empty Cloud Monastery, so right outside New York City in the United States. It's morning, so it's 8:30. So some people have perhaps finished breakfast, or they're about to have breakfast, or they might be looking forward to lunch if they didn't have time to have breakfast. So we usually talk about hunger in terms of things that relate to the body and to a physical sensation of wanting to use food essentially to appease that hunger sensation. But at the same time, there is what the Buddha actually talks about in terms of fulfilling, obviously, the like nourishing, of course, the body. So he talks about different types of nutriments that we use to essentially have a healthy body, and then nutriments that we have hopefully for creating the conditions for a healthy mind. So it's important to understand that actually, essentially, how the process that we're using to feed the body is not terribly different than the process that we use to feed the mind. And we're, in fact, just as we're constantly feeding the body, multiple times a day, perhaps 3 times a day, perhaps 2 times a day, perhaps 1 time a day, if you're a little bit more on the ascetic side, we call body. At the same time, we're also feeding the mind at all times. And we tend to overlook sometimes what we're actually introducing in the mind, what kind of nutriments are happening. And as a matter of fact, we nourish the mind a lot more than we nourish the body, because usually, we're not eating 24/7. Otherwise, it would be quite an unpleasant experience. But there's constant breaks, as opposed to the mind. We're constantly, filling it up, even when we're sleeping, with the dreams that the mind produces. So first and foremost, we need to start paying attention to what kind of nutriment we introduce. And kind of just like a mirror, when we look at ourselves in the mirror, we have many clues on what affects the food, right? That we introduce in our body has on the body, right? So perhaps we look at ourselves in the mirror and we see maybe we're a little bit overweight, or we're a little bit underweight, or we have some sorts of kind of skin issues and whatnot. And we can go, okay, yes, I ate maybe too much chocolate or too much dessert. So now I'm having some problems with my skin, or there were the holidays and I got a little bit overweight, or perhaps I was stressed out at work and I wasn't eating enough. So now I am undernourished and my body is a little bit afflicted and feeble and I don't have enough strength. So whether we're looking at ourselves in the mirror or we're just kind of, paying attention to the body, we can assess the situation and then correct it. And when it comes to the mind, actually, we can have a clear picture when we sit down and meditate, right? When we sit down and meditate, it's very important to first and foremost assess what kind of mind do we have. So is it, for example, greedy for sensual pleasures? Or is it hateful of our experience? Perhaps we don't like our meditation object, or our body starts aching and our experience becomes not the best, or maybe we have memories and thoughts of people that we dislike or that bothered us, so our mind can be very much full of aversion. Or perhaps it's plagued by restlessness, right? Or remorse, maybe something that we've done and said a long time ago that we regret and it starts haunting us. Or perhaps we just have that kind of desire to do something or to move rather than staying still. And maybe actually our experience instead is drowsy. We're experiencing sloth and torpor and we kind of fall asleep, and meditation is not really that exciting. Not terribly different actually than restlessness, than in the situation of restlessness. The mind somewhat becomes a little bit rebellious, right? And the question is, are we trying to somewhat avoid the situation, avoid being with ourselves? And is that the reason why we're spacing out? Or is there's actually, just real tiredness in the mind? Or are we instead plagued with skepticism, right? Like lots of different questions. What am I doing here? I don't know about this meditation. Maybe actually if I if I took a walk, or if I ate a nice cake, since we were talking earlier about actual food, maybe perhaps I would feel a little bit happier than having to face my defilements here in meditation practice. So lots of things can come up as we're meditating. And usually when we experience these hindrances, we either pursue them. So in the case of thoughts, perhaps we engage with them, or perhaps we try to battle them, right? And try to win, kind of control them and subdue them. And often these strategies are quite often unsuccessful, right? But instead, perhaps we can actually, kind of take a step back and instead learn from what is happening in our experience. So instead of going straight into action, we can actually observe, first and foremost, assess the situation. In Tibetan Buddhism, actually, the word, if I remember correctly, for meditation is gom, which means essentially familiarizing ourselves with the mind. So it's a process where we understand, no different than the mirror, how we kind of have a first glimpse of what our face looks like. Ajahn Jayanto, lovely bhikkhu from the Thai forest tradition, when he came to teach with us a few years ago, he actually invited us to reflect how we're kind of like these headless monsters. We have a sense that there is a head, but we actually have never seen it, right? We have never seen our own head. It's impossible to see our own head. And the only way that we have a perception of the head is through looking at ourselves in the mirror. So it's kind of the same thing, actually, the mind, right? It's somewhat, I mean, we obviously have an experience of the mind, everything is the mind, but we um, don't have a straightforward way through which we relate to the mind. And so meditation practice is that act that allows us to, first and foremost, sit down and kind of really start familiarizing ourselves with the qualities of our mind rather than distracting ourselves from the mind, so to speak. And so getting back to the hindrances actually can be our friends rather than our enemies. And our friends in the way that they kind of inform us of what we're doing the rest of the time, what we're cultivating. So the Buddha says that the hindrances come with nourishment, not without nourishment. So it's not that they come, out of nowhere, but there's actually something that we do that creates those consequences that we call hindrances. So essentially, the quest of controlling them on the spot is similar to looking at ourselves in the mirror and seeing that we're, overweight or underweight, and then we, kind of try to lose or gain weight by pure mind force, mind control. So obviously, that kind of we already have an intuitive understanding that that's pretty much a waste of time at best, right? If I look at myself and I'm like, okay, Ayya Soma, now lose weight. And I can just force myself. Of course, it doesn't work that way. I have to put the conditions for that to happen, or vice versa, to gain weight, etc. So once again, we understand that with the body, we need to put conditions in place. But with the mind, we tend to think that, we own this, that it belongs to us, that it's something that we can control, right? So we tend to go straight into sort of wishful thinking and wishful action. And usually, at worst, we reinforce the hindrances. We reinforce whatever we are trying to defeat. And at best, we kind of just keep on doing whatever we've been doing up until now. So when we start instead looking at our experience with wisdom, we start, once again, familiarizing ourselves with what the situation is, with what is going on. And we have a clear way of practicing Vipassana, so seeing clearly that nothing, including the mind, so with its emotions, its barriers, its hindrances, belongs to us, but rather it's, as with everything, a product of causes and conditions from the past. So essentially what we're seeing in our mind is vipaka. And we cannot control vipaka, right? We cannot control the consequences of our actions. But we can control kamma. We can control the actions that we're making right here and now. So we can control the causes, not the consequences, but the causes. And that's the great, wonderful news, good news that the Buddha gives us, and that empowers us to make good choices that then have good vipaka, not bad choices that then have bad vipaka. And by bad vipaka, I mean results that essentially bring suffering as a result, right? So we're aiming for happiness. So we follow the teachings of the Buddha in order to understand how to make the kamma that leads towards unconditional happiness, towards the cessation of suffering. So once again, we cannot control the consequences, but we can control the causes. And we understand this causality, and we look at the mind and see, okay, when this action comes into being, then this is sort of the consequence here. How about I make new choices that instead create new consequences that lead to peace, tranquility, and happiness, rather than, greed, hatred, delusion, restlessness, skepticism, and so forth. And we acknowledge, we take ownership of our actions. We take responsibilities towards the hindrances rather than, just seeing them as these obstacles that prevent us from having a kind of peaceful and blissful meditation. And it becomes actually, once again, the hindrances become our friends that give us a sense of what we're doing that is not particularly beneficial. And so the Buddha tells us that, for example, if we're having lots of thoughts of greed, lots of thoughts of, you know, any type of lust that can arise in the mind, essentially the cause is that we're constantly paying attention to the sign of the beautiful and pretty much obsessing about it and cultivating it without skillfully reflecting on it, without contemplating the consequences of our action. So the Buddha invites us to instead pay attention to the drawbacks of our experience. So instead of looking at the subha, looking at the asubha, so the non-beautiful. And so we start having a bit of a more balanced and comprehensive 360-degree picture of our experience. And then on the flip side, if the mind, on the other hand, is afflicted by hatred, essentially it's because we're constantly paying attention to the sign of the ugly, of the disagreeable, rather than the ugly, the disagreeable, right? So we don't like this, we don't want this, it has to stop. But interestingly enough, the Buddha doesn't tell us that the antidote for hatred is to pay attention to the sign of the beautiful, right? So it's not the flip side as it was before. But rather, instead, he invites us to cultivate a mind of loving kindness, to cultivate essentially the Brahma Viharas, and create a nice abode, really nice abode, a divine abode where we want to dwell, and where hatred essentially has no kind of fertile soil where to germinate, right? Where to where to flourish. And when it comes to restlessness and remorse, obviously remorse usually is caused by a lack of following the precepts, lack of sila, or by, restlessness also it's constantly chasing pleasant feelings, or trying to keep busy. So we can reinforce our commitment to virtue. We can reinforce our commitment to sila. Take the 5 precepts, the 8 precepts, during the Upasata, and then paying attention to the sign of tranquility is very useful. Sign of peacefulness, very useful to create the conditions for restlessness not to kind of have a way, once again, to set into the mind. So practicing samatha and, of course, samadhi. And we can reflect also on the effects of the precepts on the mind, and the mind naturally, starts delighting, becomes happy when we reflect on our own virtue. When we reflect on the Buddha, the qualities of the Buddha, the qualities of the Dhamma, the qualities of the Sangha, but also the qualities of our virtue, of our sila. And a happy mind gets easily concentrated. So once again, we have a nice sort of fertile soil where the opposite, essentially, of restlessness can germinate. And because we're following the precepts and we're recollecting how good our conduct is, then there is also no remorse. So we see how these precepts, are not restrictive of our freedom, but rather they're gifts that the Buddha gives us. Very incredible, beneficial gifts that immediately bring a lot of peace to the mind. And they're incredibly connected to, actually, they are the basis of anything that we do in Buddhist practice. Whether we're lay people or whether we are monastics, it doesn't matter. But without a good foundation of precepts, then inevitably the mind will be incapable, essentially, to make any progress in the path. And when it comes to doubt, usually it's because we are spending our time paying attention to perhaps subjects that create the grounds for doubt to invade the mind, or perhaps indulging in unhelpful thinking, like who am I, who was I in past lives, what am I going to become in future lives, etc., etc. Engaging in this unhelpful thinking that then reinforces the atta. So instead of understanding truly anatta, we are reinforcing a sense of self. So what I want to do whenever these thoughts appear in the mind, well, if they're related to actually Buddhist doctrine, and right now we're not 100% sure about certain topics of Dhamma, it's either good to shelf them if we don't have either a monastic or someone who is ahead of us in the path that we can consult and ask questions to. So we either shelf them and actually focus on instead what really speaks to us and what we can currently, focus our practice on. Or we can, if we have access to monastics or teachers or people who are ahead of us in the path. I really like the word sensei actually in Japanese, that literally it's the word that is used for teacher, but literally means just one step ahead on the path. So literally we can go to, a sensei, multiple senseis actually would be great, and ask questions. So it can clarify our doubt, it can clarify our questions, and then we won't have that skepticism afflicting us. So we see how, it's essential to familiarize ourselves with our own mind, familiarizing ourselves with what is going on currently, so that we can apply the antidotes to the hindrances, and not only while we're meditating, but rather with everything that we're doing, from the moment we sleep to the moment that we from the moment we wake up to the moment that we go to bed, and in between, because also sleep is affected obviously by everything that we're doing throughout the day. And in this way, we are denourishing the hindrances, and instead we're feeding the bhujangas, the enlightenment factors. So we are starving out the sort of, causes of our suffering, and instead nourishing the causes for happiness to arise in the mind. And we can actually, reflect on the experience and really see that. For example, we're cultivating Dhammavichaya, investigation of states, just by seeing, reflecting on the hindrances, seeing how we're relating to the hindrances, and relating to it in how, our habits, some are kusala and some are akusala, but not so beneficial and non-beneficial, but not in an intellectual way, not, in reading a book, but rather in looking at our experience, investigating our mind once again with sati, so with mindfulness. And this is no different than how the Buddha, approached this practice. Some of my favorite suttas are when the Buddha specifically describes, when he's an unenlightened bodhisattva, and how he has thoughts of greed, hatred, and illusion appearing in the mind, or how he has certain insights, but also is afflicted by certain hindrances, and how he overcomes them. And he does so, by reflecting once again on his experience, not ignoring the thoughts that appear in his mind, but rather contemplating them and seeing, is this beneficial for myself? And is this beneficial for others? And is this beneficial for myself and others? And so when we're doing this practice, we're following in the footsteps of the Buddha. And we're also applying, obviously, energy. So we're cultivating virya by cultivating well, first of all, interest in our experience, but then also doing the practice of actually cultivating what is good and what is and nourishing, what is instead unwholesome, right? So we're taking agency once again. That is an action that we're doing, and we're empowered, and we are developing once again the enlightenment factor of virya, that naturally, of course, creates sort of piti in the mind, so rapture, so happiness and enthusiasm. And this is also interconnected actually with the practice of the precepts. I mean, everything, as we mentioned earlier, is founded and rooted on sila. But yeah, this practice essentially allows us to take joy in meditation, in following virtue, in the development of wisdom. And as we said earlier, happy mind is easily concentrated. So then passaddhi, like tranquility, and samadhi, concentration, naturally kind of come into being. Everything is dependently arisen, right? So sometimes we just have to focus on a few things, and then kind of everything else comes into being by itself, sort of like the game of domino. You kind of hit one piece, and then everything naturally flows into place, kind of. It's just one part of the practice. And, passaddhi and samadhi obviously are also developed when we're tackling the hindrances of restlessness and drowsiness, but not, in a kind of forceful way or in an intellectual way, but once again, creating these conditions. And the actual practice of understanding causality, so paticca samuppada, essentially, instead of being this thing that we recite or that we read, and that can be very intellectual and a little bit disconnected with our lives sometimes, if we just open a book or hear a Dhamma talk without really investigating our experience. When we start instead seeing causality in everything that we do in our lives, then naturally upekkha also comes into being, is nourished by default. So equanimity. Because we're seeing closely. That's what upekkha means, seeing closely. And when we see closely at our experience, we see how it's impersonal. It's not who we are, but rather it's dependently arisen. So we stop identifying with it, and naturally the mind is more balanced. Naturally the mind suffers less and less until full awakening. And once again, we evaluate the mind by practicing in accordance with the teachings of the Buddha, and we see that suffering decreases and happiness increases. And why is that? Because we're finally actually taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. We're finally following the teachings of the Buddha. So we're not, just abiding in ritual, and then instead taking refuge in the fridge, so to speak, whenever something terrible happens to us, we're unhappy. And the easiest thing these days, since usually there's much more abundance of food than there has ever been in the history of humanity, in many countries, many different countries. Yeah, usually the first thing that we do is kind of open the fridge or pick up the phone, and we take refuge in Facebook, or take refuge in social media, or take refuge in videos and films and movies. That's essentially what we're doing. And the result is increased suffering, right? Because we are essentially we are understanding that there is suffering, but we are looking at the escape from suffering in our usual way, which is, instead of following the teachings of the Buddha, we're looking for other sensual pleasures to replace the sensual pleasures that weren't reliable up until then. So instead, the Buddha tells us a different way, a different escape. And we can experientially see it for ourselves whenever we reflect on our experience and practice what the Buddha tells us. And when we're practicing the teachings, that's when we are, in fact, then once again, taking real refuge in what is worthy of refuge. We're really seeing how and why the triple gem is called the triple gem, why it's not called the triple things, the three things, the three random things that we worship sometimes. And so our altars are all the beautiful practices that we do in Buddhism, all the symbology, then starts having a different meaning. And a meaning that is profound and that, really has an impact in every single thing that we do every single day. So these are a few thoughts and reflections this morning. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions or comments or ideas. You're all welcome to type them in, and I'll try my best to answer them. All right. So we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
We have a question from one of the people who joined. I will share it on the screen.
All right. Good to see you, Janaki. So, dear Ayya, do you mean by treating hindrances rather as friends is that those keep the mind alert? I would say when I'm talking about treating hindrances as friends is, when we are hanging out with our friends, we're usually, if we're good friends anyway, we're usually curious and interested in their experience. And we ask them questions, right? We're like, hello, how are you doing? How was your day? If a friend has a problem, we usually ask them what is going on with them. And we kind of have that sort of interest towards friends, and our friends then can help us also when we are struggling. So befriending, I guess, maybe is, so English is not my first language, so I apologize in advance if things are not clear, and please, you're welcome to ask questions at any time to clarify what I'm saying. Yeah, so befriending them in the way that they are actually, they give us information on what we're doing, information on our conduct, information that then we can use to pretty much assess the situation. Like, what exactly are we doing with our lives? What is going well and what is going wrong? And then we can tailor our practices in order to have the results that we want to achieve, which are hopefully our happiness and peacefulness and contentment and less suffering. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Ayya, for answering the question. Since we have no other questions, I would like to invite Ayya to conduct the Anumodana for the Devas and the departed.
Sure, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for all the Buddhist Mahavihara team, all the friends in Malaysia, and all the friends worldwide who have joined us this morning. So it's really, morning here in the US, but probably evening in Malaysia, and different times of day in different parts of the world. Well, reflecting that it's actually a really good deed, what we've all been doing together. There's so many different things that we can do with our time, and actually intentionally deciding to dedicate our time, investing our time to listening to the Dhamma, contemplating the Dhamma, and practicing the Dhamma is one of the most incredible things that we can do for ourselves and others, for the benefit of ourselves and others. So we can take this opportunity to share the merit with all sentient beings, whether they are in this world or in other world, whether they have bodies or they don't have bodies, whether they're in on Earth or in different realms of existence. So if you'd like, you can also join in with me in sharing the merit. Etavata cham hehi sambatam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhyam. Etavata cham hehi sambatam punya sampadam sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampatti siddhyam. Etavata cham hehi sambatam punya sampadam sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampatti siddhyam. Idam me nyatinam hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo. Idam me nyatinam hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo. Idam me nyatinam hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo. And we can wish for ourselves to always be surrounded by good Kalyanamitta friends. Imina punya kammena mame bala samagamo satam samagamo hotu yavani panapatiyam. And the aspiration for attaining supreme blissful nibbana. Idam me punyam asavakayavaham hotu sabba dukkha pamunchatu sabba bhaya pamunchatu sabba roga pamunchatu. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May you all be well, happy, and peaceful, and may all good things come to you.
Now that we have almost come to the end of today's Dhamma talk, I would like to thank Ayya Soma Theri on behalf of the Committee and Management of Buddhist Mahavihara Malaysia. And I would also like to thank today's sponsors and everyone that has joined this evening. Thank you, Sukhi Hotu.